In medieval Europe, the most important and immediate marker of beauty was skin tone, and unlike today where bronzed skin is often associated with leisure and wealth, pale skin was the ultimate sign of status, refinement, and desirability, because pale skin meant you did not work outdoors, did not toil in fields, and did not expose your body to the harshness of manual labor, which was reserved for peasants, servants, and the poor, so for noble women and women of the rising merchant class. Remaining pale was not simply a preference, it was a declaration of identity, and to achieve this look women avoided sunlight whenever possible, covering their faces with veils, hoods, and wide hats, walking under shade, or remaining indoors for long hours, and when nature alone was not enough, artificial methods were used, many of them dangerous, including face powders made from lead, chalk, or vinegar solutions that slowly damaged the skin, causing irritation, sores, and long-term poisoning. Yet the immediate whitening effect was considered worth the cost, because a pale face suggested delicacy, obedience, and a life untouched by physical strain. This obsession with paleness extended beyond women, though it weighed most heavily upon them, as men were allowed a little more color due to expectations of outdoor activity, but even then excessive tanning was associated with low birth and coarse living, and the medieval imagination strongly linked external appearance with internal moral condition, meaning that a woman with smooth, pale skin was believed to be more virtuous, more modest, and closer to spiritual purity, while a woman with darker or weathered skin risked being perceived as lustful, aggressive, or morally loose, regardless of her actual behavior, and this belief system made beauty deeply moralized, turning the body into a visual sermon about virtue. Bathing, contrary to modern myths, was not entirely unknown in the Middle Ages, but it was irregular and cautious, as many people believed that hot water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body, especially during times of plague, so excessive washing was considered dangerous rather than hygienic, and instead people cleaned themselves with cloths, perfumes, and herbal rinses, attempting to maintain an appearance of cleanliness rather than actual sanitation, and beauty manuals of the time often focused less on cleanliness and more on masking odors, smoothing skin texture, and lightening complexion, because what mattered most was how the body appeared to others, not how healthy it truly was. Hair removal was another crucial element of medieval beauty, especially facial hair, and women were expected to have completely smooth faces, free of visible body hair, which was considered animalistic and unfeminine, so eyebrows were often thinned or removed entirely, eyelashes plucked out, and facial hair scraped away using pumice stones, tweezers, or crude razors, all done without modern lighting, mirrors, or pain relief, and this practice often led to infections and scarring, yet a bare, smooth face was seen as elegant and refined, while thick brows or visible lashes were considered coarse or even sinful, because the ideal female face was meant to appear calm, open, and childlike, free of strong lines or shadows that might suggest passion or intelligence beyond what society allowed women to display. Perhaps the most striking and painful beauty trend of medieval Europe was the obsession with the high forehead, which became fashionable in the late Middle Ages, particularly among noblewomen, and a high, broad forehead was believed to signal intelligence, nobility, and spiritual purity, so women deliberately plucked or shaved their hairlines back, sometimes several inches, creating an elongated face that looked unnatural to modern eyes but was deeply admired at the time, and this practice was often accompanied by the thinning or complete removal of eyebrows, resulting in a smooth, pale, nearly blank upper face that emphasized modesty and emotional restraint, and while this trend caused hair loss, irritation, and sometimes permanent damage, it persisted for generations because beauty standards in medieval society were enforced not only by fashion but by marriage prospects, social mobility, and fear of judgment. All of this existed within a world where mirrors were rare, expensive, and often distorted, made from polished metal rather than glass, meaning that most people never truly saw themselves clearly, and beauty was therefore constructed not through self-observation but through instruction, imitation, and social pressure, passed down through mothers, midwives, religious teachings, and courtly traditions. And this made beauty less personal and more communal, less about individual expression and more about fitting into a narrow, rigid ideal that reflected class hierarchy, religious morality, and deeply ingrained fear of disorder, because in medieval times, beauty was not meant to be expressive, it was meant to be controlled. In medieval times, beauty was not limited to the face alone, because the body itself was treated as a visible sign of morality, fertility, and social order, and unlike modern beauty ideals that shift rapidly between thinness and curves, the medieval ideal body was shaped by scarcity, labor, and survival, meaning that what was considered attractive often reflected what was rare, and for much of the Middle Ages, a softly rounded body was admired, especially among women of higher status, because thinness was associated with poverty, illness, famine, and excessive labor, while a fuller figure suggested access to food, protection from hunger, and a life lived indoors rather than in the fields. Yet this fullness was meant to be controlled and modest, not exaggerated, because excess in any form was considered sinful, and beauty was always expected to sit quietly within the boundaries of restraint. For women, the ideal body was youthful but not childish, fertile but not overtly sexual, and above all, modest in its proportions, with narrow shoulders, small breasts, gently rounded hips, and a smooth, unbroken silhouette beneath layers of clothing, and unlike later centuries that emphasized cleavage or dramatic curves, medieval fashion actively concealed the natural shape of the female body, using long gowns, high waists, flowing sleeves, and stiff underlayers to create a straight, elongated line that drew attention away from the chest and hips, because female beauty was meant to suggest purity and obedience rather than desire, and clothing functioned as a moral filter, shaping how the body was perceived by others while hiding what was considered dangerous or tempting. Small breasts were generally preferred, particularly in noble and courtly circles, because large breasts were associated with peasant women, wet nurses, and physical labor, and in medieval art and literature, the ideal woman is often described as having a maidenly chest, smooth and subtle, reinforcing the idea that beauty lay in delicacy rather than abundance. And while pregnancy and motherhood were respected as necessities, they were not romanticized visually, meaning that the visibly maternal body was not treated as an ideal to be displayed, but as a private, functional state, and once a woman bore children, especially multiple children, her values shifted away from beauty and toward duty, with appearance becoming less important than modest behavior and domestic obedience. Men, too, were subject to bodily ideals, though with far greater flexibility, as the medieval male body was expected to appear strong and capable without seeming brutish, and a well-built frame suggested readiness for labor, combat, and authority, but excessive muscle was not celebrated in the way it is today, because visible bulk implied manual work, which placed a man lower on the social ladder. And instead the ideal nobleman was described as lean, upright, broad-shouldered, and balanced, with enough strength to command respect but enough refinement to signal distance from physical toil, and this balance mirrored the broader medieval obsession with order, where everything, including the human body, was expected to remain in its proper place. Weight itself was deeply symbolic, because hunger was a constant threat for much of the population, and famine was a recurring reality, so a body that carried some softness was a sign of stability and blessing, yet gluttony was condemned as a deadly sin, meaning that too much weight could quickly shift from attractive to shameful, especially for men in positions of authority or religious life. And sermons often warned that an undisciplined body reflected an undisciplined soul, reinforcing the belief that beauty was inseparable from self-control, and that the body must never appear to enjoy pleasure too openly. Diet played a subtle but powerful role in shaping beauty standards, as access to white bread, meat, dairy, and sugar was limited by class, and these foods were associated with refinement and health, while coarse grains and vegetables were linked to poverty, so the bodies of the wealthy were literally shaped by privilege, appearing softer, paler, and less worn, while the poor carried the visible marks of hardship, including thinness, calloused hands, bent posture, and weathered skin, all of which reinforced the idea that beauty was not something earned, but something inherited through birth and circumstance. Physical deformities, scars, and visible illness were heavily stigmatized, not only because they disrupted aesthetic ideals, but because they were often interpreted as signs of divine punishment or moral failing, and while many people lived with injuries from labor, war, or disease, these marks placed individuals outside the boundaries of conventional beauty and sometimes outside full social acceptance. Particularly for women, whose value in marriage depended heavily on appearance, and a woman marked by illness or injury could find herself excluded, regardless of her character or abilities, reinforcing the harsh reality that medieval beauty standards were not gentle preferences, but systems that determined life outcomes. What makes these standards especially heavy is that most people had little control over their bodies, as food shortages, disease, and hard labor shaped physical appearance from childhood onward, yet society judged beauty as if it were a moral choice, praising those whose bodies aligned with the ideal and quietly shaming those who did not, and this created a culture where beauty was not enjoyed, but endured. Something to be maintained carefully through modest living, controlled eating, proper posture, and constant awareness of how one appeared to others, because in medieval life, the body was never neutral, it was always speaking, always signaling status, virtue, and worth, whether a person wished it to or not. In medieval society, hair carried an extraordinary amount of meaning, far beyond simple appearance, because it was seen as a visible extension of the soul, and the way a person wore, colored, or concealed their hair could signal virtue, temptation, obedience, or rebellion, especially for women, whose hair was considered both one of their greatest natural beauties and one of their greatest moral risks, and as a result, medieval beauty standards treated hair not as something to be freely styled or enjoyed, but as something that needed constant control, discipline, and sometimes concealment, because uncontrolled beauty was believed to invite sin, chaos, and divine punishment. Long hair was widely admired in women, associated with youth, fertility, and natural beauty, yet paradoxically, it was rarely meant to be seen in public, as respectable married women were expected to cover their hair completely with veils, wimples, or headdresses, while unmarried girls were allowed more visibility, and this distinction turned hair into a marker of sexual availability and social status. Where uncovered hair suggested youth and potential marriage, while covered hair signaled modesty, obedience, and belonging to a household, and a woman who displayed her hair openly without social permission risked being judged as vain, immoral, or dangerously seductive, regardless of her intentions. Color mattered deeply, because certain hair colors carried symbolic weight that could shape a person's reputation from birth, with blonde or light hair often idealized in poetry and religious imagery as pure, angelic, and divinely favored, particularly when paired with pale skin and light eyes, while dark hair, though common, was sometimes associated with earthiness, passion, and unpredictability. And red hair occupied the most dangerous position of all, frequently linked to betrayal, lust, witchcraft, and even association with the devil, influenced by religious art that portrayed figures like Judas with red hair, and this meant that naturally red-haired women were often viewed with suspicion, regardless of their behavior, showing how beauty standards could quickly turn into social punishment. Because of these associations, hair alteration became a quiet but widespread practice, as women sought to lighten their hair using herbal mixtures, sun exposure, or chemical solutions made from sulfur, urine, or vinegar, all of which damaged the scalp and hair over time, yet achieving a lighter shade was considered worth the risk. Especially in courtly environments where appearance played a role in securing favorable marriages or patronage, and these practices were passed down through informal knowledge rather than written manuals, meaning that beauty routines were often dangerous, inconsistent, and guided more by rumor than science. Men's hair carried its own expectations, though with less moral scrutiny, as a man's hairstyle was expected to reflect his role in society, with short, controlled hair signaling discipline and order, especially among clergy and soldiers, while longer hair was associated with youth, nobility, or artistic temperament, and beards were treated with ambivalence, admired as symbols of maturity and wisdom in some periods, while discouraged in others due to associations with wildness or lack of refinement, and these shifting standards reflected the broader medieval concern with balance, where the ideal man was neither too polished nor too unkempt, but carefully positioned between strength and restraint. Hair removal extended beyond the face, as medieval beauty ideals favored a smooth, hairless body, especially for women, because body hair was seen as animalistic and uncontrolled, and though full body hair removal was not common, attention was paid to visible areas such as the hairline, temples, and sometimes even the nape of the neck, and these practices reinforced the idea that beauty required constant effort, pain, and vigilance, even in a world without modern tools, mirrors, or privacy, and failure to meet these expectations could invite ridicule or social exclusion. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of medieval beauty standards surrounding hair was the fear of being too beautiful, because excessive beauty was believed to be dangerous, particularly in women, as it was thought to provoke lust in men, disrupt social order, and invite divine punishment, and religious teachings often warned that outward beauty was a test sent by God, one that could lead to vanity, temptation, and moral downfall if not carefully managed, and this belief placed women in an impossible position, expected to be attractive enough to secure marriage and honor their family, but not so attractive that they drew attention, envy, or accusations of immorality. This fear shaped not only personal grooming but also behavior, posture, and expression, as a beautiful woman was expected to move modestly, speak softly, lower her gaze, and avoid drawing attention to herself, reinforcing the idea that beauty was acceptable only when it remained quiet, contained, and apologetic, and this constant self-monitoring turned beauty into a burden rather than a pleasure. Something to be carefully restrained rather than celebrated, because in medieval society beauty that was not controlled was not admired, it was feared. In the medieval world, cosmetics existed in a strange space between necessity and sin, because while beauty was valued, openly enhancing one's appearance was often condemned, especially by the Church, which warned that altering the body God had given was a form of vanity, deception, or even blasphemy. Yet despite these warnings, cosmetic practices quietly flourished, passed between women in private spaces, whispered among midwives, servants, and noble households, because the pressure to appear beautiful, healthy, and virtuous did not disappear simply because it was forbidden, and so medieval beauty became a secret ritual, hidden beneath layers of moral anxiety and religious fear. The most common cosmetic goal was to achieve a pale, smooth complexion, free from blemishes, redness, or signs of illness, and to do this, women used face powders and creams made from chalk, ground alabaster, egg whites, vinegar, and most dangerously, lead-based compounds, which provided an immediate whitening effect but slowly poisoned the body, causing hair loss, skin ulcers, blackened teeth, and neurological damage over time. Yet the gradual harm was rarely connected directly to the cosmetics themselves, because illness was often attributed to divine will and balance of humors, or fate, allowing these practices to continue for generations without question. Rouge was used sparingly, because visibly flushed cheeks could suggest immodesty or lust, yet a completely colorless face risked appearing sickly, so women applied subtle tints made from crushed berries, plant dyes, or insects, blending them carefully to create the illusion of natural health rather than obvious makeup, and lips were lightly colored using similar substances, often mixed with animal fat or wax, producing a soft red hue that suggested vitality without excess, and the goal was always to look naturally beautiful rather than artificially enhanced, because obvious cosmetics could lead to accusations of deceit, seduction, or even witchcraft. Eye makeup existed, but it was minimal and controversial, as darkened eyes were associated with Eastern cultures, sensuality, and foreign influence, which made them suspect in much of medieval Europe, so while some women used soot, ash, or herbal mixtures to darken lashes or define eyes, these practices were often limited to private settings or specific regions, and heavy eye makeup could draw suspicion, particularly during periods of moral panic, when women who stood out visually were more likely to be accused of immoral behavior or unnatural practices. Skincare routines focused less on cleansing and more on treatment, as medieval people believed that the skin reflected internal balance, and so beauty recipes often included dietary advice, bloodletting, herbal tonics, and purging, all intended to correct perceived imbalances in the body's humors, and a clear complexion was thought to result from proper digestion, emotional moderation, and spiritual purity. rather than external care alone, reinforcing the belief that beauty was not just skin deep, but a visible sign of inner order and moral alignment. Religious life offered an alternative relationship to beauty, as nuns were expected to renounce physical attractiveness entirely, covering their bodies, cutting their hair, and rejecting adornment as a spiritual sacrifice. Yet even within convents, beauty did not disappear completely, as young, attractive novices were sometimes praised for their natural purity, while older or less conventionally attractive women found fewer opportunities for advancement, revealing that beauty standards followed women even into spaces meant to transcend the physical world. What becomes clear is that medieval beauty was not about self-expression or pleasure, but about compliance, because looking the right way meant behaving the right way, and beauty standards reinforced obedience to gender roles, class hierarchy, and religious authority, rewarding those who fit quietly into their assigned positions and marginalizing those who did not, and in this way, beauty became one of the most powerful tools of social control, shaping lives not through force alone, but through expectation, judgment, and fear. Perfume and scent played a crucial role in beauty, especially in a world where bathing was limited and strong odors were common, and medieval people used scented oils, pomades, and herbal sachets to mask unpleasant smells and create an aura of refinement, often carrying small containers filled with spices, ambergris, or dried flowers, and pleasant scent was associated with cleanliness, health, and even holiness. As saints were sometimes described as emitting sweet fragrances, while foul smells were linked to disease, decay, and moral corruption, making scent an invisible but powerful part of medieval beauty standards. What made cosmetics particularly dangerous was not only their physical toxicity, but their moral risk, because a woman who relied too heavily on makeup could be accused of deception, tempting men with false beauty, or attempting to rise above her social station, and these accusations could have serious consequences, especially in times of social unrest. When fear of disorder often focused on women's bodies and appearances, and in extreme cases, unusual beauty practices could be used as evidence. In witchcraft trials, where altered appearance was interpreted as unnatural or demonic. Despite all of this, women continued to use cosmetics, not out of vanity alone, but out of necessity, because beauty in medieval society was tied to survival, marriage, safety, and social acceptance, and to appear too plain could be just as dangerous as appearing too bold, forcing women to walk a narrow line between enhancement and restraint, between health and sin, and this constant balancing act made beauty a quiet labor, performed daily and carefully, often in fear, because in the medieval world, looking pure came at a very real cost. Men experienced similar divisions, though with greater freedom, as noblemen were judged by their bearing, clothing, and controlled masculinity, expected to appear strong yet restrained, capable of violence yet governed by honor, while peasant men were valued for endurance and productivity rather than refinement, and physical roughness was accepted, even expected, though it still marked them as lower status. And across classes, male beauty was more closely linked to authority and capability than morality, allowing men to age, scar, and harden without losing social value in the way women often did. Gender shaped beauty standards more harshly than class alone, because women's bodies were treated as symbols of family honor and moral order, and a woman's appearance could reflect not only on herself, but on her father, husband, and entire household, meaning that beauty failures were rarely private, and public judgment could follow a woman throughout her life, while men's appearances were allowed to change more freely with age, experience, and circumstance, reinforcing the idea that beauty was a duty imposed on women rather than a personal attribute. Age played a crucial role, because medieval beauty was deeply tied to youth, especially for women, and as soon as signs of aging appeared, including wrinkles, graying hair, or changes in body shape, a woman's social value often declined sharply, regardless of her wisdom or experience, and older women were frequently pushed out of beauty narratives altogether, sometimes even becoming figures of suspicion or fear. As aged female bodies were associated with decay, bitterness, or witchcraft, while older men were more likely to be associated with authority, wisdom, or leadership, highlighting a deeply uneven standard that punished women simply for surviving long enough to age. Although the medieval world feels distant, its beauty standards did not disappear with castles, plagues, or candlelight, because many of the ideas formed during those centuries settled deeply into cultural memory, quietly shaping how beauty is understood even now, especially the belief that appearance reflects morality, discipline, and personal worth, a belief that continues to follow women more closely than men. Just as it did in the Middle Ages, and while modern society speaks the language of choice and self-expression, the echoes of medieval thinking remain surprisingly clear beneath the surface. The association between pale skin and refinement may have shifted in fashion, but the deeper idea that skin tone signals class and lifestyle remains, as beauty ideals continue to reward bodies that appear untouched by hardship, stress, or physical labor, favoring smoothness, symmetry, and controlled imperfection, much like medieval standards did, and even the pressure to look naturally beautiful without obvious effort mirrors medieval anxieties about deception and excess, where beauty was only acceptable when it appeared effortless, restrained, and morally safe. The medieval fear of being too beautiful also survives in subtler forms, as women today are still expected to balance attractiveness with respectability, to be appealing without appearing vain, confident without appearing threatening, and desirable without appearing improper, a contradiction that echoes the impossible standards placed on medieval women, who were judged not only for how they looked, but for how their beauty made others feel, reinforcing the idea that beauty is never neutral, but always carries social responsibility. In medieval society, beauty was never a single universal standard because it shifted dramatically depending on class, gender, and occupation, and what was admired in a noblewoman could be irrelevant, or even inappropriate for a peasant, while the expectations placed upon men and women were shaped less by personal taste and more by rigid social roles, and this made beauty a language of hierarchy, where appearance communicated not only attractiveness, but obedience, status, and one's proper place in the world. For noblewomen and women of the upper classes, beauty was closely tied to leisure, delicacy, and controlled living, because their value lay in representing family honor, forming political marriages, and producing legitimate heirs, and their appearance was expected to reflect a life untouched by physical hardship, with pale skin, soft hands, carefully managed hair, and composed posture, all of which signaled wealth, protection, and refinement, and these women were often trained from a young age to sit, walk, speak, and even gesture in ways that enhanced their perceived beauty, reinforcing the idea that beauty was not natural, but carefully taught and constantly maintained. Peasant women, on the other hand, lived under entirely different expectations, as their beauty was less about appearance and more about usefulness, health, and endurance, because survival depended on physical labor, fertility, and resilience, and while youth and strength were appreciated, there was little space for cosmetic refinement, and sun-darkened skin, muscular limbs, and practical clothing were normal and necessary, yet despite their importance to society's survival, peasant women were rarely celebrated in beauty ideals, and their bodies were often described as coarse or rough in contrast to the softness of the elite, reinforcing class divisions through appearance alone. Aging continues to reveal the sharpest divide, because just as medieval women lost social value as their beauty faded, modern culture still struggles to value women beyond youth, while allowing men to age into authority, wisdom, or distinction, and this imbalance reflects a long-standing tradition where female worth was tied to fertility and appearance, while male worth was tied to action and power. A tradition that began long before modern media, deeply rooted in medieval social structure. Even the danger associated with beauty persists, though it now appears through different forms, as highly visible women face scrutiny, judgment, and backlash for their appearance, behavior, or perceived influence, much like medieval women whose beauty drew suspicion or accusation, reminding us that beauty has long been treated as something that must be regulated, controlled, or explained, rather than simply enjoyed. What medieval beauty standards reveal most clearly is that beauty has rarely been about pleasure or freedom, and instead has often functioned as a system of expectations designed to maintain order, reward conformity, and punish deviation, shaping lives quietly but powerfully, And understanding this history allows us to see modern beauty pressures not as personal failures, but as inherited ideas, passed down through centuries of social control, fear, and hierarchy. And so, as this story comes to a gentle close, we are left not with a strange or unfamiliar past, but with a mirror, one that reflects how deeply history continues to influence the way bodies are judged, valued, and disciplined, and perhaps by recognizing how medieval beauty standards once shaped lives under candlelight and stone walls, we can loosen their grip on ourselves, allowing beauty to become something quieter, kinder, and finally, something chosen rather than endured.